Welcome to your storytelling. Enjoy the stories, and don't forget to subscribe. I met him when I was in my 20s, full of hope and excitement about the future. He was everything I ever dreamed of, charming, confident, and loving. I couldn't believe someone like him would choose me, but as time went on, I began to feel there was something off about him. A lingering unease I couldn't explain. He was perfect, but too perfect. I just didn't know how far back his obsession with me went. At first, it was the little things. He'd show up at places I frequented, but it didn't seem like coincidence. A coffee shop where I always went, a bookstore I loved. It made me nervous, but I brushed it off, telling myself I was overthinking. He'd smile and laugh it off when I mentioned it, as though I was just being paranoid. But something deep inside kept telling me there was more to it. There was no way this was just a coincidence. It wasn't until one night, when we were sitting in my apartment, that I realized just how deeply he'd been involved in my life before we even met. He mentioned an obscure detail about my childhood, something I had never told him. Not a soul knew about it. He casually spoke about it like it was common knowledge. My heart dropped. How could he possibly know that? My stomach twisted. This was no accident. He had been watching me, even before we crossed paths. He was the perfect husband. He knew exactly what to say to calm me when I was stressed, always giving me compliments, showing me affection. It was easy to feel loved, to believe he was the ideal partner. But at the same time, there was something unnerving about his perfection. How he'd always be there. How he seemed to anticipate my every need. It was as if he was molding me into his perfect version of what a wife should be. I didn't realize until later, he wasn't just loving me, he was controlling me. The more I thought about it, the more I started to dig. Old photos, things I'd forgotten, tiny mementos I'd left behind. Everywhere I looked, I saw signs of his presence long before we met. He had infiltrated my life in ways I couldn't fathom. From social media posts to places I used to visit, he was always one step ahead, always there, lurking in the shadows. I should have been more suspicious, but his charm had clouded my judgment. Now, everything felt like a lie. I stumbled upon a box one evening while cleaning out our closet. Inside, there were pictures of me, taken at different points in my life, some from years before we met. My heart raced. How was this possible? Some were taken at places I frequented alone, others in my apartment when I thought I was alone. I realized then, with cold dread, that he had been watching me long before we met. He had been part of my life, a shadow in my every step, orchestrating my movements. I couldn't stop thinking about the photographs. As I looked at each one, it became clear. He wasn't just watching me from a distance. He had meticulously mapped out my life, weaving himself into the fabric of it without me knowing. How long had this been going on? My gut told me there was more, that these pictures were just the tip of the iceberg. I had to find out how deep this went, but I was terrified of what I might uncover. It wasn't just the photos. As I started digging deeper, I discovered old records, receipts, even hotel reservations in my name from years ago. He had hired people to monitor me, to track my every move, even sending anonymous messages to people I knew to plant seeds of doubt in their minds. He had weaved a web of control around me, and I had been caught in it without ever realizing. My entire life was a puppet show, and he was pulling the strings. One evening, I confronted him, my hands shaking with anger and fear. "Why are you doing this?" I demanded. His response was chilling. He didn't deny anything. Instead, he calmly looked at me, almost with pity, as if he were the one wronged. "You don't understand," he said. "I did it because I love you. I always have. You were meant to be mine." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I felt sick. This was no love. It was obsession. After the confrontation, everything became a blur. He turned everything around on me, twisting my words until I started to doubt myself. "You're imagining things," he'd say. "I don't know what's gotten into you." He was so convincing, so calm in his demeanor. I started questioning my sanity. Was I overreacting? Was I truly just paranoid? Slowly, I began to lose myself, caught in his lies and manipulation. It was like I couldn't trust my own mind anymore. As days passed, I began to feel disconnected from reality. The walls of my own home felt like a prison, and his presence loomed over me, suffocating. Every time I looked at him, I saw a stranger. He wasn't the man I had fallen in love with. He was a stranger who had buried himself inside my life, pretending to be someone else. My own thoughts felt distorted, clouded by his influence. How could I escape from someone who knew me better than I knew myself? The fear started creeping in, slowly but surely. I'd see him standing in the doorway, staring at me in silence for hours, as if waiting for me to speak first. He'd never break his gaze. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night to find him watching me sleep. His eyes would be wide open, watching my every breath. The panic would rise in my chest, my heart racing as I realized there was nowhere I could hide. He was always there, always watching. I started losing touch with my friends, distancing myself from everyone I once knew. He discouraged it, subtly at first, with little remarks about how I didn't need anyone else. He'd say things like, "You have me. Why would you need them?" He made me feel like they were the ones who didn't care, that they were a distraction from what mattered, him. Slowly, I cut off ties with everyone. I felt so alone, trapped in a world where only he existed, and I was too scared to leave. I realized too late that I was caught in his web. Every part of my life, my job, my friends, my family, had been manipulated. He'd already planned it all out, and I had walked right into it. I started to feel like a puppet on strings, pulled in every direction by his whims. His control was subtle, insidious, like poison in my veins. The more I fought, the more entangled I became. The harder I tried to escape, the tighter the web became. One day, I made a decision. I packed a bag, my heart pounding in my chest, and I left. But it wasn't long before he found me. He tracked me down, showing up at my apartment with a calm smile on his face, as if nothing had happened. "You can't leave me," he said. "I won't let you." He made me feel guilty for even trying. He used his charm, his manipulation, to pull me back in. I felt weak. How had he done it again? I couldn't fight him. Not this time. In the days that followed, I uncovered more about his past. He'd done this before. He had a history of manipulating and controlling women, each one another victim in his twisted game. But this time, it was different. I wasn't just a victim. I was the final piece of his plan, the last woman he needed to complete his collection. His obsession was deeper than I could ever have imagined, and I had no idea how to stop it. I had been nothing but a pawn in his game. The moment I realized I wasn't the first woman he had stalked, my blood ran cold. He had a pattern, each woman followed by the next, like some twisted collection. I wasn't special to him, just the next step in his control. I felt sick. He had spent years, maybe even decades, perfecting this sick cycle. And now, I was just another chapter in his twisted obsession. I wasn't just a victim. I was another cog in his machine. The pressure he put on me grew unbearable. He wanted me to be perfect, his perfect wife, the perfect woman. He didn't love me, he loved the idea of me, the version of me he had created in his mind. Every word I said, every action I took, was scrutinized. I could feel myself slipping away, becoming more like the person he wanted me to be, not the person I truly was. I was losing my identity, and it terrified me to the core. Fear became my constant companion. Every time I turned a corner, I felt him there, watching. Every phone call, every glance, every text felt like a trap. He knew everything about me, even the smallest details, and I had no idea how. It wasn't just physical anymore. It was psychological. I felt hunted, like prey. My heart raced constantly, my thoughts scrambled, my mind gripped by terror. No matter what I did, I couldn't escape. He was always there. The threats began, subtle at first, but they quickly escalated. "You don't want to see what happens if you try to leave again," he said, his voice cold and controlled. "I'll ruin you. Your life will be mine to destroy." He smiled as if he were offering me a deal. I could feel the weight of his words pressing down on me. He had the power to destroy everything. My reputation, my career, my relationships, and he wasn't afraid to use it. I couldn't risk crossing him. I started planning. It wasn't just about leaving him. It was about survival. I had to think strategically, leave no trace, no evidence, no way for him to track me down. But how could I do it without him noticing? He knew everything about me, where I went, who I spoke to, what I liked. He'd always been ahead of me, always watching. I had to be smarter, faster, more careful than ever. The pressure of it all felt unbearable, but I had to do it. I had no other choice. I thought I had made it. I found a new place, changed my number, started a new life. For a while, it felt like I was free, until I saw him in a cafe across the street from my apartment. He was sitting there, watching me with that same unnerving calmness. My heart dropped. He had found me again. I had barely escaped his grip, and yet here he was, always one step behind me. There was no running, no hiding. He always found me. I couldn't believe it when I uncovered the depth of his manipulation. He had infiltrated every part of my life. My job, my finances, even my closest relationships. The people I trusted had been complicit, unknowingly or not. He had planted himself into every facet of my world, creating a network of control that I couldn't break free from. The betrayal ran deeper than I could have ever imagined. He had orchestrated my life as if it were a script, and I was just playing my part. I realized too late that I had been living in a trap all along. Every step I took, every decision I made, was part of his plan. It wasn't just about controlling me, it was about owning me. He had manipulated every relationship, every moment, until I was so isolated that I couldn't see a way out. Every time I tried to leave, he would reel me back in with his charm, his manipulation, his promises. I was nothing more than a prize to him, something to be possessed. He knew my weaknesses, and he used them against me. The little insecurities I had, the fears that haunted me, he knew them all. He turned my own vulnerabilities into weapons, making me doubt my own strength, my own sanity. "You'll never make it without me," he'd say. "You're not strong enough to survive on your own." Slowly, I started to believe him. I began to feel weak, powerless. It was as if he had stripped away every ounce of confidence I had, leaving me fragile and scared. I tried to fight back. I tried to outsmart him, to escape his grasp. But every move I made, every plan I put into motion, he seemed to anticipate. It was like a sick game of cat and mouse, with him always one step ahead, always watching, always waiting. I couldn't figure out how he was doing it. I would change my routine, my appearance, even my location, but somehow, he always knew. It felt like I was trapped in a never-ending cycle of fear and deceit. One night, he finally confessed everything. "I've been following you for years," he said. "You were never supposed to know. I've been planning us for a long time. You were always meant to be mine." The words sent chills through my body. He wasn't just obsessed with me. He had orchestrated my entire life. I wasn't just a part of his world. I was his world. He had manipulated my every step, my every choice, to bring me to this point. And now, I couldn't escape. His demeanor had shifted. Gone was the charming, loving man I thought I knew. In his place stood someone unrecognizable, cold, calculated, and completely detached. He no longer tried to pretend he was anything other than a predator. He'd spent years breaking me down, piece by piece, until I no longer knew who I was. The love I thought we shared now felt like a cruel joke. He wasn't my husband. He was the warden of my prison, and I was his captive. He began to turn our daily interactions into a game, a sick power struggle. He would test my reactions, pushing my limits, watching me squirm with each new move. Every time I resisted, he'd retaliate with something even more cruel, more manipulative. It was as though he was waiting for me to break, to crumble under the weight of his control. And the worst part was, I felt myself giving in. I couldn't seem to escape. His presence consumed everything. Even as I plotted my escape, a part of me couldn't shake the guilt. How had I allowed this to happen? How had I let him take over my life so completely? I used to be strong, independent. But now, I felt like a shell of the person I once was. His words echoed in my mind. "You need me. You can't survive without me." Was that true? Was I so weak, so broken, that I needed him to exist? The guilt gnawed at me, even as I planned my next move. There were moments, fleeting moments, where I thought I could fight back. I began to secretly reach out to old friends, sending cryptic messages, or meeting in places where I thought he wouldn't find me. Each small act of rebellion felt like a victory, but it was always short-lived. He would catch on, like a predator sensing its prey's escape attempt. He'd confront me, his face calm, but his eyes burning with a terrifying intensity. "You can't leave me," he'd say. "You're mine." One day, he gave me hope. He told me he would let me go if I did one thing, one final act of submission. He promised that if I followed his commands, he would release me from his control. I believed him, or at least, I wanted to. Maybe this was my chance. Maybe I could finally escape. But deep down, I knew better. His promises were always lies, traps to make me stay. It was just another form of manipulation, one more way to bind me to him forever. I couldn't wait any longer. I had to leave, and I had to do it now. I gathered what little strength I had left and made a plan. One final attempt to break free. This time, I couldn't afford to fail. I made sure there were no traces, no evidence that could lead him back to me. I carefully mapped out every escape route, every contingency. But even as I packed my things, I knew it wouldn't be easy. I knew he would be coming for me, and I couldn't afford to be caught. It didn't take long for him to notice I was gone. He was always watching, always lurking in the shadows. I'd barely made it out of the apartment when I saw him, standing across the street, staring at me with a look of cold fury in his eyes. He was chasing me, and this time, there was no turning back. I had to keep moving. I had to outrun him. But as I ran, I realized the truth. He would never stop. He would hunt me down, no matter where I went. It wasn't long before he caught up with me. I found myself cornered, trapped in an alley with nowhere to go. "You're mine," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You always were. You can't escape me." The terror was overwhelming, but something inside me snapped. I was done running. I was done hiding. "No," I whispered, my voice trembling but defiant. "You don't own me. Not anymore." For the first time, I felt like I had the power to fight back. But would it be enough? He gave me a choice: come back with him or face the consequences. The consequences weren't just physical. They were psychological, emotional, and devastating. He threatened to ruin my life, my career, my relationships. But in that moment, I knew I couldn't go back. I couldn't allow him to control me any longer. It was the hardest decision I'd ever made, but it was the only choice I had. I would have to fight, no matter the cost. I would not let him win. As I fought him off, I realized just how desperate he had become. His eyes were wild, his face twisted in rage. He had lost control, and that scared him more than anything. I had finally broken free of his manipulation, and it terrified him. He couldn't stand the thought of losing me, of losing the grip he had on me. But I had nothing left to fear. I had already lost everything to him. Now, I had everything to gain by escaping. It wasn't easy. I had to be clever, resourceful, but somehow, I found a way out. I used everything he taught me against him, his own traps, his own weaknesses, and in the end, I escaped. But as I drove away, my heart still raced. I knew he wouldn't give up. He'd come for me again, sooner or later. But this time, I was ready. I had taken back control of my life, and I wouldn't let him destroy me again. Even though I had escaped, the aftermath was a constant battle. Every sound, every knock at the door, every unfamiliar face made my heart race. He had left a permanent scar on me, a mark I couldn't erase. But I was alive. I was free, and that was enough. I began to rebuild my life, piece by piece. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick, but I was determined. I had faced my worst fear and survived. That was something he could never take from me. Years have passed, and I've found a new peace, a new life. But the fear never completely goes away. I still check the locks on the doors, still glance nervously over my shoulder. He's out there, somewhere, still watching, still waiting. And I know that I can't let my guard down. The fear has become a part of me, a constant shadow. But I will keep living, keep moving forward. Because no matter what, I refuse to let him win. One evening, as I was cooking dinner, there was a knock at the door. I froze. My heart stopped. I hadn't heard from him in years, and I had thought I was safe. But standing there in front of me was a man I didn't recognize. Yet his eyes, those haunting, familiar eyes. "You don't remember me, do you?" he asked, his voice unnervingly calm. I felt the blood drain from my face. The man wasn't him, but he was one of his spies, someone he had sent to track me down. I didn't let the man inside. I refused to acknowledge him. But he left something, a message, wrapped in a small envelope. It was a photograph of me, taken in a moment of my new life, smiling and free. On the back, written in his handwriting, were the words, "You can never escape me." My stomach turned, and I could feel the walls closing in once more. No matter how far I ran, no matter how hard I tried, he always found a way to remind me that he was still out there. The thought of him still being out there, lurking in the shadows, haunted me. He'd always been the puppeteer, pulling the strings, and now he had others doing his bidding. I couldn't live my life in constant fear of being watched. But no matter how hard I tried to shake it off, the unease never left. I double-checked everything, my phone, my emails, my surroundings. Every unfamiliar face felt like a threat. I was never truly safe. One night, after a particularly long day of trying to live normally, I broke down. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was okay. I couldn't keep pretending I wasn't terrified. The constant fear had worn me down to the point where I could hardly function. I hadn't just escaped him physically. I was still shackled mentally, emotionally, in ways I couldn't even explain. The woman I used to be, the one full of confidence and strength, felt like a distant memory. I reached out to a therapist, someone who could help me make sense of everything that had happened. She was kind, patient, and listened to every word I said without judgment. It was the first time in years that I felt heard, truly heard. Slowly, she helped me rebuild the shattered pieces of my identity. She taught me to reclaim my power, to confront the trauma instead of hiding from it. It was a long road, but I was learning how to live again. This time, on my own terms. The healing process wasn't linear. Some days, I felt stronger than ever. On other days, the weight of everything would crash down on me, and I'd feel overwhelmed by the memories, the fear, the betrayal. But I was learning to navigate it. I was learning to trust myself again, to stand on my own 2 feet. I had been through hell, and while the scars would always remain, I knew that I wasn't defined by them. I was so much more than the woman he tried to break. As time went on, I allowed myself to hope that maybe, just maybe, he had forgotten about me. Maybe he had moved on, found another victim, another woman to control. I wanted to believe that, but deep down, I knew better. He had always come back, no matter how much time had passed. I couldn't let myself get comfortable. The false hope I clung to was just another trap I was setting for myself. The reality was clear. He wasn't done with me, and he never would be. Then it happened, another phone call. My hands shook as I answered, my heart hammering in my chest. The voice on the other end was cold, emotionless. "You've been living in peace for too long," he said, his voice sending chills down my spine. "But peace is temporary. You know that better than anyone." I could hear the smile in his voice, the satisfaction in knowing that he still had control over me, even from a distance. I was done pretending I was free. I never had been. I realized something in that moment. I couldn't keep living in fear. I couldn't let him control me from afar. I had to face him. It was the only way to reclaim my life for good. I wasn't going to let him haunt me forever. If I had to confront him, face to face, I would. I would take back every inch of my freedom, every ounce of power he had stolen from me. It was time to end this once and for all. But I had no idea what the consequences of that decision would be. The day of the final confrontation arrived. I met him in a neutral place, somewhere public where he couldn't do anything too drastic. But I wasn't going there to beg for mercy. I was going to show him that I was no longer his victim. I was going to stand tall, face him, and take back everything he had stolen. He didn't expect this. The fear, the trembling, the woman he had controlled, she was gone. And as I walked away from him, I knew one thing for certain. I was free.